Hey everybody, Mr. Moffman coming at you again. Today we're taking a look at AP U.S. Government Topic 1.9, taking a look at federalism in action. Now, of course, when we talk about federalism, federalism is all about sharing. You know, when you're a little kid, your parents tell you about the importance of sharing your toys, okay? And when we talk about government, it is a sharing system. Now, normally we think of federalism as sharing power between the national, state, and local governments, and that is, the broad general definition of federalism. But if we are to expand this idea of sharing a little bit more broadly, we're going to be taking a look at sharing power between various branches of government. Now, note, it's not just important to understand in a theoretical sense how federalism works and how government sharing works, government power sharing works, but to apply it and applying it to policy. Now, once again, when we say policy, policy is talking about actions of government. Policy is the ways and means by which the government attempts to solve problems and address issues going on in society. So with that being said, when we take a look at the application of federalism in terms of policy, we're going to be applying it in this case to issues dealing with environmentalism. Now, once again, you could apply this to all sorts of different topics. It could be education, it could be drug policy, it could be you name it, immigration policy, whatever. But in this particular case, we're going to be taking a look at environmentalism, and this is the first of a few-part lesson focusing in on federalism in action, with at least the first two parts focusing in on the application of federalism towards environmental policy. And in this particular lesson, we're going to be taking a look at how the executive and legislative branches share that policy, share that power with regard to environmental policy. Now, when we think of environmentalism, environmentalism was something that the founders weren't particularly thinking about at the time of the creation of the Constitution. But of course, through things such as industrialization taking place in the 19th century, issues regarding the fate of our environment started to become of more significance, especially with progressive presidents at the beginning of the 20th century, and of course, most famously with this guy, good old Teddy, good old TR, Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is going to be associated with this idea that the government is to act as the steward of the people. And in his mind, most importantly, that primary steward is the President of the United States leading the executive branch. So with this idea that the president has a responsibility to act in the best interests of the people, to look out for the needs of the people and identify what the people need, in many respects, even before the people themselves really are cognizant of what they need, Roosevelt is going to be on the forefront in terms of using federal power and explicitly executive branch power to try to protect the environment. Now, you might be thinking, well, why TR? Why this guy? Well, for those that don't know Theodore Roosevelt's background, yes, he was born into basically, New York aristocracy, one of the, wealthy old-time Dutch families in New York City. But shortly after a tragic incident where his wife died in childbirth, Roosevelt basically kind of walked away from New York life for a few years and made his way out to the Dakotas. And in that experience, kind of acting as this, cowboy, for lack of a better term, for a few years, Roosevelt gets an understanding of what the natural environment of America is outside of the concrete jungle of an urban metroplex like New York City. And he realizes that the environment is not only beautiful, but must be protected. And not just protected in the sense of just don't touch it, but also properly managed by the federal government so that resources are best utilized. So Roosevelt definitely is going to be on the forefront of the idea of using the federal government's power vis-a-vis environmental policy. And that's going to be applied in the creation of a numerous amount of national parks. Oh, excuse me, pardon me, a little sneeze there. Anyway, now, even though Roosevelt does not create the first national park, that's Yellowstone, that's done by Benjamin Harrison, Roosevelt is going to be responsible for the creation of more national parks than any other president in American history. And we're going to be seeing over time 230 million acres protected by the federal government. And this is going to be through executive branch authority, using that power of the president to basically force the Interior Department to be responsible for the maintenance of a lot of protected territory. Now note, environmental policy is not unilaterally taken by the executive branch. It is shared. And of course it is shared with the other primary branch for policy, and of course that is Congress, the legislative branch. Now, when we start to see more actions of Congress vis-a-vis environmentalism, we have to fast forward quite a bit past Theodore Roosevelt and get more into the 1960s, a much more liberal era in terms of the federal government. And American culture was changing in this time period, especially regarding environmentalism. There was a growing sense amongst young people especially that the environment must be protected from the abuses of, the free market in terms of industrialization. This is a time period where littering was at an all-time high. You had the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catching on fire. You had the work of Leslie Carson talking about the evils of DDT. So by the time we get to the 1960s, we see more and more liberal activists on the left that are environmentalists trying to push Congress to create more environmentally friendly legislation. And we will start to see that happen in the early 1970s. We see a few key examples of the creation of, for example, the National Emergency Policy Act, which is going to require the executive branch under the president, those numerous agencies like the EPA and the Department of the Interior, etc., to complete environmental impact reports on projects that are done, with regards to federal money. So in other words, there's an idea that anything that the government does has to be mindful of the environmental impact that it has. So that's a significant thing. Now, some, point to things like this as, well, this slows down, progress. This slows down the development of business, for example, and maybe infrastructure projects and things like that. But it is also, though, a way to make sure that we do not make disastrous mistakes that could have a permanently damaging effect on the environment. Adding to this, probably much more well-known, are the Clean Air Act of 1970 and the Clean Water Act of 1972. These are going to lead to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the main government, arm, if you will, to enforce environmental policies that are passed by Congress. So you've got to remember, Congress passes the laws. So in other words, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act are laws that are passed by Congress, which then have to be enforced by an executive branch agency. And that's where the EPA comes in. That's the executive branch agency that enforces laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. We also see right around the same time period the passage of the Endangered Species Act, which, for example, passes the responsibility of protecting wildlife that are part of the endangered species list to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So in other words, the federal government is saying that there is a responsibility to make sure that species of, wildlife in this country are protected. For example, the buffalo was a long-time part of the endangered species list. And so the Department of the Interior, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, was responsible for enforcing laws that protected these endangered species, protect them from poaching and, or any type of industrial activity that might harm some types of species. Once again, you will hear complaints that will say, well, hey, I don't like that the federal government gets involved and, tells me I can't, build, such and such highway or bridge on this area because it might disrupt the mating patterns of salmon that are endangered or whatever. Well, that's seen as a priority by the government. So, once again, government is really required to try to make the best decisions from conflicting interests, but understand that, that is considered an interest, protecting endangered species. We also saw the creation via Congress, via the legislative branch. And once again, the key thing of this is making sure you're looking at both what the executive branch and Congress can do, is the creation of something called Superfund. Superfund was created in the 1970s as a way to address major environmental disasters. If you have a major oil spill, for example, that might be responsible for billions upon billions of dollars of damage, a company that was responsible, an oil company that would be responsible for creating that mess, may or may not have the financial resources to cover the cost of the cleanup. And so the question becomes, well, what do you do at this point? Well, that's where Superfund comes in. Superfund is a government agency that is responsible for having businesses basically pay in to this fund that is responsible for covering the costs of cleanup for these major environmental disasters, so that these things can be addressed. Environmental disasters that are not addressed can have even greater negative consequences. One of the more famous early examples of an application of Superfund is regarding the Love Canal disaster of the 1970s. Love Canal was located near Niagara Falls up in New York, and that community started to become adjacent to a garbage dump that was built in the 1920s, and then by the 1940s evidently was dumping all sorts of hazardous chemicals unbeknownst to the local community. And unfortunately, by the 1960s and 70s, we started to see the results of these hazardous chemicals making their way into the groundwater, which then led to outrageously high levels of cancer, particularly leukemia, in the community. And once it was found out that the area was the result of a major environmental disaster, Superfund was responsible for then cleaning up that waste site. Unfortunately, Love Canal no longer exists because it's basically uninhabitable because of what happened, but the idea that this can be cleaned up is the result of government action via legislative action, and then, of course, enforced by the executive branch. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is part one of a two-part look at environmental policy regarding federalism. So we'll catch you next time to round that out. See you later. Bye-bye.